The fourth night brought the same ritual: pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans arranged on the white ceramic plate. I set it on the porch table at 8:30 sharp, said the prayer my father had taught me, and stepped back inside. The deadbolt clicked home with its familiar weight, but as I settled into my chair with coffee, the silence felt different, heavier. At 10:15, the knocking began again, but tonight it didn't stop after one circuit. The entity, or whatever it was, made 3 complete rounds of the house. Each time, the knocking grew more insistent. By the third pass, the windows rattled in their frames. I stayed in my chair until dawn, following Rule 3. Even when the knocking turned to scratching, even when something started testing the window latches, morning revealed the 4th untouched plate. I dumped the congealed food and tried to think of what my father would have done. The rules had worked for 6 years. They'd worked for my father's entire life, and his father before him. Something had changed, but I didn't know what. But when I stepped onto the porch the next morning with my coffee, the plate sat there untouched. I stopped, dead in my tracks, steam from my mug curling up into the cold air. The pot roast looked exactly the same, maybe a little more congealed from the overnight chill, but otherwise identical to how I'd left it. Even the fork sat in the same position, balanced against the edge of the plate. My chest tightened. In 6 years, this had never happened. Not once. Even during the worst blizzards, even when I'd been sick and could barely manage to heat up a can of soup, the food had always been taken. I picked up the plate with hands that weren't quite steady. The ceramic was ice cold, frost forming around the edges where condensation had frozen overnight. I carried it inside and scraped the contents into the garbage disposal, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe whatever took the food was sick. Maybe it had found a better source somewhere else. Maybe I'd done something wrong with the preparation. That evening, I made sure to prepare something different. Fried chicken with biscuits and honey, one of Dad's favorites when he was alive. I set it out at the usual time, said a quiet prayer under my breath, and went inside to wait. The night passed in complete silence. No scraping, no clinking, no soft sounds of movement on the porch. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to nothing but the wind and the house settling around me. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by the nagging certainty that something fundamental had shifted. Morning brought the same result. The plate sat exactly where I'd left it, the chicken now gray and unappetizing in the pale sunlight. I dumped it and tried to convince myself this was just a temporary change. Maybe whatever had been taking the food was hibernating early. Maybe it had moved on to better hunting grounds. But deep down, I knew better. The rules Dad had taught me weren't suggestions or old wives' tales. They were survival instructions passed down through 4 generations of men who'd lived on this land. And rule number 1 had just stopped working. The third night, I prepared a simple meal: beef stew with fresh bread, the kind of hearty fare that had never failed to disappear by morning. I set it out with extra care, making sure the plate was centered on the small table I'd built specifically for this purpose. The bread was still warm from the oven. I went inside and tried to read, but the words swam on the page. Every small sound made me look up. The refrigerator cycling on, the furnace kicking in, the old floorboards expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. But from outside, nothing. Around midnight, I heard the knocking. The knocking started again that 4th night, just after 10. 3 measured raps on the front door, pause, then 3 more. I stayed in my chair, coffee growing cold in my hands, watching the pattern repeat. By midnight, it had circled the house 12 times. My knuckles were white from gripping the coffee mug, and I'd stopped counting after the 15th circuit. The entity, or whatever it was, seemed to have all the time in the world. The knocking stopped around 3 in the morning. I sat in that chair until dawn, following Rule 3 like my father had drilled into me since I was old enough to understand. Morning brought another untouched plate. The beef stew had formed a skin on top, and the bread was hard as a rock. Fourth night in a row. I scraped it all into the garbage disposal and tried not to think about what that meant. The pattern continued for the next week. Every night, the systematic knocking. Every morning, untouched food. I started preparing different meals, pork chops, spaghetti, even my grandmother's apple pie recipe. Nothing worked. The food sat there until dawn, getting cold and congealed while something circled my house, testing every possible entrance. The knocking started again at 10:15 p.m., just like it had every night for the past week. 3 sharp raps on the front door, then silence. I sat in my chair with my coffee, waiting for what I knew would come next. The entity moved to the kitchen window, tap, 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 then around to the back door. The same measured rhythm, like it was following some kind of protocol. But tonight felt different. The pauses between locations were shorter, and I could swear I heard something else. A second set of knocks coming from the living room window, while the first was still at the back door. I gripped my coffee mug tighter. 2 of them. That had never happened before. The knocking continued its circuit, but now I was sure. Multiple entities testing different entry points at the same time. The front door rattled under heavy impacts while something scratched at the basement window. My hands started shaking, coffee sloshing in the mug. Then the radio turned on. Dad's old Zenith sat on the kitchen counter where it had been for the past 15 years, unplugged since the day he died. But music was coming from it anyway, some old country song I didn't recognize. The volume was low, just background noise, but it was definitely playing. Rule 4. If the radio plays, leave the room immediately. I set down my coffee and walked to the living room, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor. The knocking followed me, moving to the windows closest to wherever I went, like they were tracking my movement inside the house. The music stopped after maybe 10 minutes. I waited another 5, then went back to the kitchen. The radio was silent, its power cord still coiled on the counter where I'd left it years ago. The next morning brought another untouched plate. Scrambled eggs and bacon, cold and congealed. I scraped it into the garbage disposal and tried to think through what was happening. The rules had worked for generations. Dad had followed them his whole life, never had a problem. Grandpa too. But something was changing. I spent the day going through Dad's papers in the basement, looking for anything that might explain the radio. Most of it was farm records and tax documents, but buried in an old shoebox I found a leather journal I'd never seen before. Dad's handwriting, but from decades ago, based on the faded ink. March 15th, 1987. Radio played 3 times today. Had to keep moving between rooms, getting worse as the moon gets fuller. March 18th, 1987. Found great-great-grandfather's notes in the attic. He wrote about times when they get more aggressive. Says it happens every few generations. The rules still work, but they test harder. March 20th, 1987. Full moon tonight. Barricaded myself in the center room like the notes said. They came from every direction but couldn't get in. Radio played all night, even though I'd thrown it in the well. I flipped through more pages. Dad had dealt with this exact same thing when he was my age. The entries described weeks of escalating activity, multiple entities, the radio playing constantly. But he'd gotten through it by following additional instructions from our great-great-grandfather. I needed to find those notes. The attic access was in the upstairs hallway, a pull-down ladder I hadn't used in years. Dust and cobwebs covered everything up there, but in the far corner I found an old trunk with my great-great-grandfather's initials carved into the lid. Inside were dozens of handwritten pages, some so old the paper was yellow and brittle. The earliest entries were dated 1923, written in careful script that was hard to read. But as I worked through them, a pattern emerged. The entities test the boundaries every 20 to 30 years. They probe for weaknesses, try new approaches. The rules hold, but they require absolute adherence during these periods. Any deviation invites catastrophe. When multiple entities appear, they are coordinating their efforts. They will attempt to overwhelm through simultaneous attacks from different vectors. The radio phenomenon indicates they are influencing electrical systems despite lack of power source. During the testing period, which typically lasts one lunar cycle, the defender must be prepared to retreat to the center room during the full moon. This room, being equidistant from all exterior walls, provides maximum protection. I read until my eyes burned. Page after page of encounters, strategies, observations, passed down through 4 generations. My great-great-grandfather had been methodical about documenting everything, and Dad had added his own notes in the margins. That night, the knocking started earlier, 9:30 p.m. instead of 10:15, and it was definitely multiple entities. I counted at least 3 distinct patterns happening simultaneously. One at the front door with heavy measured impacts, another at the kitchen window with rapid scratching sounds, a third at the basement entrance with what sounded like clawing. The radio turned on at 10:45 p.m. This time it was louder, some big band music from the 40s. I left the kitchen and went to the living room, but 10 minutes later it was still playing. I moved to the dining room. Still playing. Finally, I went upstairs to my bedroom and the music stopped, but 20 minutes later it started again. A different song this time, something classical with lots of violins. I had to go back downstairs to the bathroom. The music followed me, seeming to come from whatever room I'd just left. This continued all night. Every time I settled somewhere, the radio would start playing within an hour. I spent the night moving between rooms like some kind of refugee in my own house, never able to rest for more than a few minutes. By dawn, I was exhausted, my legs aching from constant movement. The knocking had stopped around 4 a.m., but the radio had played until sunrise. When I finally went to check the porch, the plate was untouched again. Pancakes and sausage, stone cold. The pattern continued for 3 more nights. Multiple entities testing the house, the radio playing constantly, forcing me to keep moving. I was getting maybe 2 hours of sleep total, grabbing cat naps when the music stopped for brief periods, but I was learning their rhythm. The knocking always started earlier as the full moon approached. The radio played more frequently, sometimes 3 or 4 times in an hour, and the entities were definitely coordinating. When one stopped knocking, another would immediately start at a different location, like they were taking shifts. On the 6th night, I counted 5 distinct knocking patterns happening at once. Every door and window on the ground floor was being tested simultaneously. The sound was overwhelming, a constant barrage of impacts and scratching that made the whole house vibrate. The radio played almost continuously, switching between stations and songs with no pattern I could identify. I spent the entire night moving between rooms, sometimes having to relocate every 10 minutes. My legs felt like rubber, and I was starting to see things in my peripheral vision. Shadows that moved wrong, shapes that shouldn't be there. But the rules were holding. The entities couldn't get in, no matter how hard they tested. The food offerings went untouched, but that seemed to be part of the testing process based on what I'd read in the old notes. 2 nights until the full moon. According to my great-great-grandfather's journal, that's when they would make their final push. Everything up to now was just preparation. I spent the day reinforcing the center room upstairs, moving supplies and preparing for what the notes called the siege. Water, food, flashlights, Dad's old hunting rifle, even though the notes said weapons were useless. The center room was directly above the kitchen, equidistant from all exterior walls, with no windows and only one door. The radio played 6 times that day, even though I'd moved it to the basement and covered it with blankets. The music seemed to come from the walls themselves, following me wherever I went. Each time I had to abandon whatever I was doing and find a different room. That evening, I prepared the dinner offering as usual, meatloaf and mashed potatoes. But I knew it wouldn't be taken. The entities were beyond that now, focused entirely on testing the house's defenses. The knocking started at 8 p.m., 3 hours earlier than the first night. This time there were so many different patterns I couldn't count them all. Every possible entry point was being tested simultaneously. Windows rattled in their frames, doors shook against their hinges, and something was definitely trying to get into the basement through the old coal chute. The radio played constantly now, switching between stations every few minutes. Country, classical, rock, talk shows, static. A chaotic mix that made it impossible to think clearly. I moved between rooms like a pinball, never able to stay anywhere for more than a few minutes. Around midnight, something new happened. The knocking stopped for about 30 seconds. Complete silence except for the radio. Then it all started again, but now the rhythm was different. All the entities were knocking in unison, creating a single massive impact that shook the entire house. They were learning, adapting, working together in ways they hadn't before. I looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall. Tomorrow night was the full moon. I sat at Dad's kitchen table with the yellowed note spread flat in front of me, reading it for what had to be the 20th time since finding it under the porch table. The paper felt brittle between my fingers, like it might crumble if I handled it wrong. But the ink? That was the thing that kept throwing me. Fresh black ink and handwriting I'd seen on old family documents, written by a man who'd been dead for over a century. The words hadn't changed since I'd first read them 3 days ago, but they still hit like a punch to the gut. 6 years of following those rules religiously, and they'd just stopped working, like a contract that had expired without warning. New Year's Eve. That gave me exactly 2 months and 3 weeks. I'd been counting the days obsessively since finding the note, like a prisoner marking time until execution. The thing was still unplugged. I could see the cord from where I sat, coiled on the floor next to the nightstand I'd dragged in here with me. But Glenn Miller's In the Mood started playing anyway. That same tinny sound from the old speakers. Soft at first, then louder, much louder. The knocking matched the beat perfectly. 3 knocks on the front door lined up with the trumpet section. The kitchen window tapped along with the drums. The back door kept time with the bass line. It was like the whole house had become some kind of instrument, and whatever was out there was playing it. I reached for the radio, thinking maybe I could turn it off or move it or something. But the moment my fingers touched the volume knob, the music got louder. Way louder. Loud enough that I had to cover my ears, loud enough that the sound seemed to come from inside my skull instead of the speakers. The knocking got louder too. Not just more frequent, actually louder, like they were using hammers instead of knuckles. The whole house shook with each impact. Pictures rattled on the walls. The windows buzzed in their frames. I pulled my hands away from the radio and the volume dropped back down, but it kept playing. The knocking kept its perfect rhythm. They were working together, I realized. The entities outside and whatever was making the radio play. They were coordinating this whole thing. This wasn't just testing anymore. This was an attack. The song ended and immediately started over. Same tune, same beat, same perfect coordination with the knocking. I counted 17 different entry points where they were hitting the house. Front door, back door, kitchen door, all the first floor windows, every upstairs window, even what sounded like the basement door I'd forgotten about. My heart hammered against my ribs. 6 years of following the rules. 6 years of clean plates and respectful distance, and now they were trying to break down every barrier I had. The food offerings hadn't worked. Staying inside hadn't worked. Even Dad's rules weren't enough anymore. The radio cycled through the same song again. And again. Each time, the knocking got more aggressive. I could hear wood creaking under the impacts. Something cracked upstairs. Maybe a window frame, maybe worse. The basement door rattled like someone was throwing their whole body against it. I pulled the blankets around me and tried to think. Dad had taught me 5 rules, but he'd never said what to do if they all failed at once. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe his dad hadn't told him. Maybe this was the thing they'd all been afraid would happen eventually. The music was so loud now I could feel it in my chest. The knocking had become a constant thunder that made the whole house vibrate. Dust fell from the ceiling. The lantern on my folding table jumped with each impact. Then, just as the eastern sky started to show the faintest hint of gray, everything stopped. The radio cut off mid-note. The knocking ended so suddenly that the silence felt like a physical thing pressing against my eardrums. I sat there in Dad's chair, still gripping the armrests, listening to my own breathing and the sound of my pulse in my ears. I waited. The gray outside the center room doorway slowly brightened to pale yellow, then proper daylight. I waited until I could hear birds chirping and a truck rumbling past on the county road before I moved. My legs were stiff from sitting in the same position all night. I squeezed past the oak dresser and walked through the house, checking each room. Everything looked normal. No broken windows, no damaged doors. Whatever they'd been doing, they hadn't actually broken anything inside. But when I stepped onto the front porch, my stomach dropped. The plate was gone. For the first time in a week, they'd actually taken the food. But the porch looked like a construction crew had torn it apart and put it back together wrong. Half the boards were loose, nails sticking up at odd angles. Deep gouges ran across the wood grain. Not random scratches, but deliberate marks carved in patterns I didn't recognize. Symbols, maybe, or some kind of writing. The porch railing had been twisted, the spindles bent into shapes that hurt to look at. The table where I'd been setting the plates was still there, but it had been moved about 3 feet to the left. The surface was covered in more of those carved marks, cut so deep they went almost halfway through the wood. I walked to where the plate had been, stepping carefully around the loose boards. That's when I saw it, a piece of paper tucked under the edge of the table, right where the plate would have sat. I picked it up with shaking hands. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, with that brittle feel of something that had been stored in an attic for decades. But the writing on it was fresh, the ink still dark. The handwriting was careful and precise, with those old-fashioned flourishes people used to make when they wrote with fountain pens. I'd never seen it before, but somehow I knew exactly whose it was. The same way you recognize a voice even when you haven't heard it in years. My great-great-grandfather's handwriting. The man who'd started all this, who'd made whatever deal had kept our family safe for 4 generations. The man who'd been dead for longer than I'd been alive. The note was short. Just a few lines in that careful script. Alexander, if you're reading this, the 5 rules have failed and the arrangement is ending. There is a 6th rule I could not teach your father, as it was not yet time. When the moon wanes, you will find what you need in the root cellar behind the false wall. The choice will be yours alone. Remember, some bargains are meant to be temporary. Your great-great-grandfather, I read it 3 times, my hands trembling so badly the paper rustled. A 6th rule. Something hidden in the root cellar that Dad had never mentioned, never even hinted at. And my great-great-grandfather had somehow known this night would come, had somehow left me instructions from beyond the grave. The porch creaked under my feet as I stepped back toward the house. The carved symbols seemed to watch me, and I had the unsettling feeling that whatever had made them was still close by, waiting to see what I'd do next. The note crinkled in my pocket as I walked inside, and I couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. I sat at Dad's kitchen table with the yellowed note spread flat in front of me, reading it for what had to be the 20th time since finding it under the porch table. The paper felt brittle between my fingers, like it might crumble if I handled it wrong. But the ink, that was the thing that kept throwing me. Fresh black ink and handwriting I'd seen on old family documents, written by a man who'd been dead for over a century. The words hadn't changed since I'd first read them 3 days ago, but they still hit like a punch to the gut. 6 years of following those rules religiously, and they'd just stopped working, like a contract that had expired without warning. I kept reading, even though I could recite it from memory now. There is a 6th rule I could never teach your father. If the other 5 ever fail, You must leave this house permanently on the next New Year's Eve. The forces we've held at bay will eventually overwhelm any stationary defense. Abandoning the territory is the only way to reset the protection. New Year's Eve. That gave me exactly 2 months and 3 weeks. I'd been counting the days obsessively since finding the note, like a prisoner marking time until execution. The worst part was the next paragraph, the one that had kept me awake for 3 straight nights. Understand this, Alexander. We have never been stopping these forces permanently. We have only been buying time. Each generation has held them back long enough to pass the burden to the next. But some bargains are meant to be temporary, buying time. That's all any of us had ever been doing. Dad, Grandpa, Great-Grandpa, all of them just holding the line until they could hand it off to the next poor bastard in the family tree. And now it was ending with me. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my shirt pocket, where I'd been carrying it like some kind of talisman. The kitchen felt different now, knowing I'd be leaving it forever. Everything looked the same. Dad's coffee mug still in the dish drainer, his reading glasses on the windowsill. The calendar on the wall still turned to the month he'd died. But it all felt temporary now, like props in a play that was about to close. The supernatural forces had kept up their nightly visits since that coordinated assault 3 nights ago, but something had changed. The knocking still came, but it felt different. Less aggressive, more patient. Like they knew something I was just figuring out. Last night there'd been only 3 knocks at the front door. Then nothing. The night before, just some soft tapping at the kitchen window that lasted maybe 10 minutes. It was like they were backing off, giving me space to process what was coming. I walked through the house slowly, really looking at everything for maybe the first time since Dad's funeral. The living room where I'd spent countless nights in his recliner, white-knuckling my way through supernatural sieges. The stairs I'd climbed as a kid, learning to step over the 3rd one that creaked. Dad's bedroom, where that damn radio had played Glenn Miller with the cord unplugged. In Dad's room, I started going through his things properly. Not the quick, grief-stricken sorting I'd done after the funeral, but a real search. If I was leaving forever, I needed to understand what I was walking away from. His dresser drawers held the usual stuff, clothes, old watches, a few photos. But in the bottom drawer, wrapped in an old towel, I found a leather journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth from handling, and when I opened it, I recognized Dad's careful handwriting. Rules and observations, the first page read. For Alexander, when he's ready. My hand shook as I turned the pages. Dad had been keeping detailed records, dates, times, descriptions of supernatural activity. 6 years' worth of notes about the nightly food offerings, the sounds, the patterns, things he'd never told me. October 15th, Alexander's 3rd week following the rules. The taking of food happened at 11:47 p.m., 17 minutes later than usual. Possible adjustment period as the arrangement transfers to new generation. December 3rd, no activity for 2 nights following Alexander's bout with flu. Entities seem to recognize when the rule keeper is incapacitated. Food left untouched, but not disturbed. March 22nd. Unusual scratching sounds at basement door. Alexander didn't hear them from upstairs. Note: basement access may become relevant in future. Page after page of observations, patterns, theories. Dad had been studying these things, trying to understand them better than just blindly following the rules. And at the very end, dated just 2 weeks before he died, was an entry that made my blood run cold. The arrangement is showing strain. 17 consecutive nights of delayed food taking, entities testing boundaries more frequently. Alexander doesn't know yet, but I fear the rules may not hold much longer. If the worst happens, he'll need to find the 6th rule. Great-great-grandfather was right to hide it from us. Some knowledge is too dangerous to carry unless absolutely necessary. He'd known. Dad had known the rules were failing, and he'd died before he could tell me. I spent the rest of that day reading through every page, absorbing decades of family knowledge I'd never been given. By evening, I understood that what I'd thought was a simple supernatural arrangement was actually something much more complex, a carefully maintained balance that had been slowly shifting for generations. The next few weeks fell into a strange routine. The supernatural forces continued their nightly visits, but they felt more like check-ins than attacks. A few knocks here, some soft scratching there, the occasional sound of footsteps on the porch. They were still there, still watching, but the urgency was gone. I used the time to gather everything I could. Dad's journal went into a box along with old family photos, documents, anything that told the story of what we'd been doing here. I found more journals in the attic, Grandpa's notes, even some pages in Great-Grandpa's spidery handwriting. 4 generations of men documenting their battles with forces they didn't fully understand. The hardest part was going through Dad's personal things. His clothes, his books, the little everyday items that made up a life. I couldn't take much with me. The note had been clear about leaving permanently, and that suggested traveling light. But I packed a few photos, his favorite coffee mug, the watch Grandpa had given him. By mid-November, the house felt like a museum of my family's history. Boxes stacked in the living room, labeled and organized, important documents in one pile, sentimental items in another, things to leave behind in a third. The supernatural forces seemed to approve of my preparations. The nightly disturbances became even more subdued, almost respectful. One night in late November, I was sitting in Dad's recliner when I heard something different. Not knocking or scratching, but what sounded like voices. Soft, indistinct, coming from somewhere outside. I crept to the front window and peered through the curtains. The yard was empty, but I could see shapes moving in the tree line, dark figures that seemed to shift and flow rather than walk. They were having some kind of gathering, and though I couldn't make out words, the tone sounded almost ceremonial, like they were preparing for something. New Year's Eve arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made the air itself feel sharp against my skin. I'd been awake since 4 a.m, not because I'd set an alarm, but because my body knew. After 2 months of preparation, this was the day I'd leave the only home I'd ever known. The truck sat in the driveway, engine block heater plugged in since yesterday to make sure it'd start when the time came. I'd loaded most of my things over the past week, the essentials of 4 generations, condensed down to what could fit in the bed of a pickup truck. I stood at the kitchen window with my last cup of coffee in this house, watching the sun struggle through the gray December sky. The note from my great-great-grandfather sat on the counter beside me, the paper worn soft from handling. I'd memorized every word by now, but I read it again anyway. When the moon wanes in the New Year's first hour, drive north on County Road 47 until you see the old grain elevator. Turn east at the crossroads and follow the gravel for 12 miles. You'll know the place when you see it. A white farmhouse with blue shutters, sitting empty, but waiting. The land there is clean. Start fresh, Alexander. The bargain ends with your leaving. The directions were specific enough, but I'd never heard of any white farmhouse with blue shutters in that area. Then again, my great-great-grandfather had been dead for over a century. A lot could change in that time, or maybe some things stayed exactly the same, waiting. I finished the coffee and set Dad's mug in the sink for the last time. The house felt different today, lighter somehow, like it was already letting go. They knew I was leaving. They were waiting. The last box sat on the kitchen table. Personal documents, birth certificates, the deed to the property, insurance papers. I'd decided to leave the deed behind. Whatever came next, this place wouldn't be mine anymore. The supernatural forces could have it back, along with whatever they'd been waiting for all these generations. I carried the final box out to the truck, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The porch looked strange without the nightly food plate. I'd stopped leaving offerings 3 days ago, and nothing had complained. The carved symbols from that terrible night in October were still visible in the wood, though they'd faded some. Battle scars from a war that was finally ending. The truck started on the second try, diesel engine coughing to life in the cold. I let it warm up while I took one last walk through the house, checking that I hadn't forgotten anything important. The rooms looked hollow, with most of the furniture covered in sheets. I'd left the heavy pieces. Dad's recliner, the kitchen table, the beds. Whoever came after me could decide what to do with them. In the living room, I stopped at the mantelpiece where 4 generations of family photos had sat. The frames were packed away, but I could still see the faint outlines in the dust where they'd been. Dad as a young man, grandfather in his army uniform, my great-grandfather standing beside a horse I'd never seen. All of them had lived with the rules, followed the arrangement, bought time with their vigilance. But time had run out, just like my great-great-grandfather had known it would. I locked the front door and walked to the truck without looking back. The engine had warmed up enough, and the heater was starting to blow actual heat instead of just cold air. I put the truck in reverse and backed down the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires. That's when I saw them. Lights were moving in the fields around the property. Not flashlights or headlights, but something else entirely. Soft, blue-white glows that drifted between the fence posts and through the bare corn stubble like oversized fireflies. There had to be dozens of them, maybe hundreds, spread out across the land that had been in my family for 4 generations. I stopped the truck at the end of the driveway and watched through the windshield. The lights moved with purpose, not random drifting. They were forming patterns, creating boundaries, marking territory. As I watched, more lights appeared at the tree line, emerging from the woods where I'd seen the dark figures gathering in November. The supernatural forces were taking back their land. I could see shapes. I could see shapes moving between the lights now. Tall, flowing forms that seemed to bend and shift like smoke-given substance. They moved across the fields with an ancient confidence, no longer hiding or waiting. The arrangement was over, and they were reclaiming what had always been theirs. One of the lights drifted closer to the truck, hovering just beyond the fence line. For a moment, I thought I saw something almost human in its glow. A face, maybe, or the suggestion of one. It pulsed once, twice, then moved away toward the house. Not threatening, just acknowledging. A farewell, perhaps, or recognition that I was keeping my part of the bargain. I put the truck in drive and pulled onto County Road 47, heading north like the note instructed. In the rearview mirror, I watched the lights spread across the entire property, growing brighter as I drove away. The farmhouse sat in the middle of it all, dark windows reflecting the supernatural glow. By morning, I wondered if anyone would even remember there'd been a house there at all. The road stretched ahead, empty and black under the star-filled sky. It was just past midnight. New Year's Day, technically, though it felt more like an ending than a beginning. I'd driven these roads my whole life, but tonight they seemed different, like I was seeing them for the first time. The old grain elevator appeared after 20 minutes of driving, exactly where the note said it would be. I'd passed it countless times over the years, but I'd never really looked at it. Now I could see it was older than I'd thought. The concrete weathered and stained, with faded letters spelling out something I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. I turned east at the crossroads, leaving the paved road for gravel. The truck's headlights cut through the night, illuminating fence posts and mailboxes, the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. Most were dark, people asleep getting ready for the new year ahead. Normal people with normal problems, who'd never had to leave food on their porches or count knocks in the night. The gravel road wound through rolling hills covered in snow, past abandoned barns and fields that stretched to the horizon. I counted the miles on the odometer. 5, 7, 10. At 11 miles, I started watching more carefully, looking for anything that matched the description in the note. At exactly 12 miles, I saw it. The white farmhouse sat about a quarter-mile off the road, connected by a long driveway that looked recently plowed. Blue shutters flanked every window, and a porch light glowed yellow against the snow. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and straight in the still air. Someone was home, or at least someone had been recently. I turned into the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires as I approached the house. It was smaller than the place I'd left behind, but it looked solid, well-maintained. The kind of place where people lived normal lives, where the biggest worry might be whether the furnace would make it through another winter. I parked near the front porch and sat in the truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled. The house was quiet, no lights moving in the windows, no signs of the supernatural forces that had dominated my life for so long. Just a house, sitting peacefully under the stars. A piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. I hadn't noticed it before, but it must have been placed there while I was driving. I got out and retrieved it, recognizing the same handwriting as the note that had started this journey. "The house is yours, Alexander. The deed is in the kitchen drawer, along with keys and instructions for the furnace. The land here has been waiting for someone who understands the old ways but isn't bound by them. Rest now. The rules that governed your family for generations have served their purpose. You are free." I folded the note and put it in my pocket alongside the first one. 2 messages from a dead man, guiding me from one life to another. I grabbed my overnight bag from the truck, the rest could wait until morning, and walked up the porch steps. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was warm and clean, furnished with simple but comfortable furniture. A fire burned low in the living room fireplace, and I could smell coffee brewing in the kitchen. Someone, or something, had prepared for my arrival. I found the deed in the kitchen drawer, just like the note promised. The property was in my name, dated today, signed with my great-great-grandfather's familiar handwriting. Impossible. But then again, I'd stopped questioning impossible things months ago. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, looking out the window at the dark fields beyond. No lights moved in the distance, no shapes gathered at the tree line, just snow and starlight and the kind of quiet that came from being truly alone for the first time in my life. The family's long struggle with the supernatural forces had finally ended. The rules had done their job for generations, keeping the bargain intact, buying time until this moment when the arrangement could be concluded properly. My great-great-grandfather had known this day would come, had planned for it, had made sure I'd have somewhere to go when the old ways were no longer enough. I was free. The thought felt strange, almost foreign. No more nightly offerings, no more counting knocks, no more rules to follow. Just a normal life in a normal house, where the biggest supernatural concern might be whether the coffee maker would work in the morning. Outside, snow began to fall, soft flakes drifting past the kitchen window. I finished my coffee and went to check the furnace, following the instructions I'd found with the deed. Everything was in working order, ready for whatever winter might bring. I'd successfully escaped before the entities could break through the final defenses, but it didn't feel like an escape. It felt like completion. The end of a story that had been written long before I was born, played out exactly as it was meant to be. Tomorrow, I'd unload the truck and start figuring out what came next. Tonight, I just sat by the fire and listened to the silence, grateful for the first peaceful New Year's Eve I'd had in my entire life.